Hello, everyone. Welcome. As guests get logged in, I wanted to welcome you today to our webinar. I am so excited to have Paige Jacobs of Powered by Paige here to talk to us about creating inclusive space, creating space that is thoughtful in our events about all of our guests and the guest experience. I wanted to provide a little business as we get started so that we can just all have a sort of clear understanding of where we can find resources. So a little bit first, after today's session, you'll be able to get a recording of the session. So I wanted to make sure that you have the details of where to find that recording. We also want to thank all of our sponsors that make all of our education possible. So a big thank you to all of our partners that sponsor our education series. We have all of our webinars that live on our education page. You can scan this QR code. We will also email it to you when it's over, so you'll get a recording of today's session. If you're looking for other content, we have lots of content on the Fundraising Elevator podcast, including Paige, who has been on the podcast before. We also have today's podcast release is talking all about safe space, and I think that today's conversation on the webinar dovetails nicely into that same conversation. You'll find that we have upcoming webinars in June all about eye safety and thinking about protecting your guests at your event, all about unlocking storytelling using animation, and about preparing for your fall fundraising events. So we encourage you to check out our webinar page where you can find upcoming webinars and where this webinar will be live. So I'm going to stop my screen share. I'm going to welcome Paige to the stage, and I'm going to ask all of our guests joining us today, drop a note in the chat, let us know where you're from and specifically where you're tuning in from. And I'm going to be taking questions at the end with Paige, so we'll have time for any questions that come up for you today. Be sure to just let us know with any questions in the chat or the Q&A. And with that, I'm going to turn my camera off and turn it over to Paige. Welcome, Paige.
Hi, thank you so much. And a big thank you to Swaim Strategies for hosting this. This is such an important topic for event planners, and it's really a pleasure to be able to share this space with everyone. So thank you, Samantha. In case you momentarily forgot which webinar it was that you signed up for, this one is called Designing for Everyone. And essentially, it's all about neuro-inclusive event design. My name is Paige, and I do event consulting, through my company, Powered by Paige. At first glance, you may have noticed that I decided to keep things casual today, and I invite you to do the same. Please feel free to leave your camera off, do what you need to do, and make yourself comfortable as we learn together. You'll notice that I move around a lot when I talk. I'm going to look at my notes here and there, and some of my slides may look a little bit dense because I've chosen to share my research and citation and sources in this presentation. In this space, we get the honor of just showing up together. So that's what we're going to do. Just be ourselves together. I got my start in events 16 years ago, which is absolutely insane to say now. I've managed or worked over 500 different events, and 500 is actually where I stopped counting. And at this point, I've worked pretty much every role in the room. I got my start working and planning conferences and really community forward events. And then I planned my wedding, and I was kind of hooked, not on weddings, but on the planning portion of things. I was one of those brides who was thoroughly comfortable doing that, and it really didn't feel like work to me. Several years after my wedding, I accidentally stumbled into coordinating another one. My husband was in the bridal party for our friend's wedding, and I really didn't want to drive by myself. So I showed up super early in the morning with him. And my plan was just to say, I can help with whatever you need, however you need it. Here I am. However, upon arrival, I discovered that the couple had misunderstood the role of a venue manager versus a day of coordinator, which is actually not uncommon. And they didn't have anyone to run their day. So a few conversations later, I stepped in as their coordinator. And it was not an easy first wedding by any means. There were 150 guests, a venue with super spotty Wi-Fi. Their tech didn't work. Their floor plan needed to be adjusted. There was ample decor to set up. There were no popcorn bags for the popcorn machine, and their caterer was 20 minutes behind schedule. But I got them down the aisle and onto the dance floor before they knew anything that had gone wrong. And at the end of the night, Their DJ came up to me and asked me for my business card. And he said, "You are one of the best coordinators I've ever worked with." And I laughed because it was my first day. And so I found out he'd been doing this for over 10 years. And when I heard this, I thought maybe there was something to this. So I kept going with event management as a side gig while I worked full time many other places. However, when my full time job would find out that I did events, suddenly my role would expand until I was doing events for them as well. So at first, I did events that gave back while I managed a book and retail store at a university. And I did community and networking events while I worked in the mortgage industry. And later, I went on to be the logistics manager at a venue. And while I was there, I was doing all kinds of events because it was at a winery, doing like nonprofit fundraising, wine focused events like club pickup parties, and chef hosted dinners. And almost a year and a half ago, I went full time into consulting and event management for myself. So at this point in my career, I truly have done a little bit of everything: design, logistics, operations, planning, staffing, catering, bartending, speaking, and a lot more. But the flip side of this is that I am a neurodivergent guest in the room as well. I have ample experience from both sides of the coin. And most of the time, even when I'm managing an event, my neurodivergent experience sounds very similar to the one I'm about to share with you. Now, before we get too much further, I really want to name that as a fellow planner, I know how hard you work. I know how deeply you care about your events and about getting things right. But this particular webinar is not about doing things right or doing things wrong. We're simply going to get curious about seeing what has historically been invisible. As I was prepping this webinar, we made the decision to move. The move is only 6 blocks away from our current home, but sometimes, especially this week, I feel like that makes it so much harder because in my brain, I should be able to just throw things together last minute and scoot it from house to house. But my planning brain knows that that is a nightmare and not what we are going to actually do. For this particular move, we're buying the house of some friends of ours, so we're very familiar with the property. And most importantly, my 5-year-old is very familiar with the property. And I'm pretty in tune with my kiddo. He's a lot like me. And so when he's off, I key into it. And so does my husband very quickly. And early on in the process of getting our house ready to sell, I was packing a bunch of stuff, I had a lot of boxes out. The house was a mess. And I noticed he was having a really tough day. And so I paused, got down on his level, cut out all the distractions, and directly asked him, "How are you feeling about moving houses?" Now we're going to pause for just a second because as adults, we know what moving entails. You're going to pack the things you need and wish you had. You'll forget what box you accidentally taped the scissors into. You labeled things, but that doesn't mean you can find them in the stacks of boxes. You're going to run out of packing tape a couple times. And overall, life is going to be pretty chaotic for the entirety of the move. And the same goes for events. We know what an event is supposed to be like. We know that there's an arc to events, especially fundraising events, where we build this thread, this through line within the story. We hit a pinnacle when the special appeal speaker comes up, and we ride the wave of collective effervescence into a few rounds of giving, with the hopes of wildly exceeding whatever fundraising goal has been set. Now let's hold that thought and let's revisit the conversation with my 5-year-old. In that experience with my son, a few things happened. My sweet baby was having an identity crisis. He felt that he had to go be someone else and live someone else's life as best that he could with the tools that were available to him. From his perspective, he was trying to mentally prepare to walk into an environment where he didn't fit, and it was bringing up a lot of discomfort in his nervous system. When I went to connect with him, I made connection easy. I removed all distractions. I got on his level. I made room for him to be himself however he felt in that moment. I gave him permission to share his big feelings with me. And in our family, we say things like, "Your big feelings are safe with me. I can hold them." I also gave him permission to engage with this process in a way that felt good for him by giving him opportunities to opt into the process. He doesn't have to help me pack all the boxes. We are saving his room to be packed last, and it'll be unpacked first in the new house. He gets to pick what color we paint his room. And I'm guiding him through this process and providing opportunities along the way. I'm going out of my way to use kid friendly language about how I feel about the move. No big fancy language that shuts him out of the process. Language about how I'm feeling overwhelmed, nervous, sad, excited. I'm using those actual terms and I'm modeling being gentle with myself. So let's compare an event to this move to the house, but my 5-year-old's version of my new house. And we're going to let that play out for just a second. Because according to him, we move. And when we walk inside, it's someone else's shoes inside the door, a worn in couch that doesn't fit how you like to sit, a table with crumbs from someone else's plate, and toys in your room that aren't yours. But you, my 5-year-old in this setting, want to do everything in your power to be okay with this because this was the experience that you were invited into. This was the moment that's been planned, built, and arranged for you. Yet everything in your body feels off. You want to crawl out of your skin and give it back to whoever it belongs because it sure as heck is not yours. Your heart rate struggles to come down. You simultaneously have tunnel vision and you're hyper aware of everything. And you're taken aback by the littlest things that just feel off. Because in my little baby's mind, moving houses meant leaving everything in ours and walking into everything in theirs. So maybe this experience wasn't necessarily built for you, but you don't know that yet. You just know that it doesn't feel right, just like he knows this doesn't feel right. Even the most well-planned event can elicit this response, especially in a neurodivergent body. And I make this connection because my son's response to the house was probably one of the best analogies I could have been handed for how a neurodivergent body can respond to a space that isn't created for them. And at this point, it's probably helpful for you to know that I discovered I was neurodivergent in my late 20s, which means that for most of my life, I tried to fit into spaces that weren't designed for me. And I found myself making these design choices to meet the needs and the feelings that I was experiencing or needing without actually knowing what I was doing. And you may have guessed as a host of this webinar that I might have been neurodivergent, or maybe you saw that I didn't show up to this webinar in the same structured professional attire as some of the other speakers you've learned from. Maybe you've noticed, like I said, I shifted my seat. I'm curled up in my chair. I look around when I'm sharing the things that are close to my heart instead of staring down the camera. I'm a little bit different sometimes, and I'm really okay with that. And although I've managed hundreds of events, 9 times out of 10, I walk through those events feeling a lot like my son would have felt walking into a new house with someone else's things inside. And I want to name this clearly. This analogy is about the house, not the person inside of it. Neurodivergent adults are not children, and nothing that I'm about to say is really about parenting or caretaking. It's about design. In fact, I don't know where you're starting out in your understanding of neurodiversity, but since you're here, I'm assuming you want to learn more, so we're going to start with the basics. Neurodivergence is a natural variation in how the human brain is wired, in how we process information, experience sensory input, connect with other people, and move throughout the world. It includes autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, sensory processing differences, and a number of other conditions. Neurodivergence affects 20% of the global population, which means in every room you've ever planned an event for, a significant portion of your guests were experiencing your event in a way that you may not have designed for, including myself. And if that 20% surprised you, that 1 in 5 number, you're really not alone in that shock. There's a reason that it feels like we're hearing about neurodivergence more now than ever before. Diagnostic criteria for decades were built primarily on studies that excluded women and people of color, as well as anyone who masked well. And many neurodivergent folks engage in camouflaging or masking, which are learned behavioral strategies to hide neurodivergent traits, such as adapting facial expressions or your tone of voice to conform to a social norm. And these early learned adaptive behaviors make neurodivergent traits sometimes less recognizable to professionals, which means that there's delayed or missed diagnoses. And the effort required to maintain such masking often comes at a considerable emotional and psychological cost, which increases vulnerability to things like burnout. The pandemic forced a lot of us neurodivergent adults to sit quietly with ourselves just long enough to realize the accommodations we had already been making without knowing why. And when the world opened back up, the gap between what our nervous systems needed and what the external world expected of us, masking, became next to impossible to ignore. So we're not seeing more neurodivergent people. We're finally seeing the ones who have always been there. I want to start with a couple of the things I hear most often when I work with planners. I hear, we added a quiet room. We have a virtual option. We put fidget tools on the table. And these things really are not bad. In fact, they're really great. But sometimes they're operating on a slightly inaccurate premise. Neuro-inclusive design isn't about adding more things. It's about curiosity, communication, and clarity. It's about really looking at your event design and asking yourself, what assumptions have I made? What am I asking guests to do that I've never explicitly given them permission to do? What am I expecting them to already know, already feel comfortable with, and already be able to navigate on their own? Every single one of those answers is a decision that you as a planner have made, but you didn't know you were making it. Here's the simplest way that I know to say this. Neurotypical event design extends a single invitation. It says, here's the experience we've built. We're inviting you to come and step into it, like my son and the new home. The assumption is that everyone will receive it roughly the same way, and that if somebody needs something different, they will know their need and they'll ask. Neuro-inclusive design assumes that regardless of the invitation you extend, each guest will experience your event differently. Not that they might experience it differently, they will. And it's the designer's job to make room for that reality from the very beginning. This shift is not about addition, it's about subtraction and scaffolding, removing the assumptions that were never conscious choices to begin with, and then building in cues and curiosity where it's appropriate. There's a breakdown in mutual understanding that occurs when people of differing dispositions attempt to interact. And within the context of an exchange between a neurotypical person and a neurodivergent person, sometimes we call them neurospicy people, this breakdown in mutual understanding often gets put onto the shoulders of the neurodivergent person, which between you and I, a very neurodivergent response to that is that they're just going to leave and never come back. But the reality is that this misunderstanding is a mutual and interpersonal issue. When we reframe the design and not instead of the people, the design, not the people, all people get to benefit from the exchange. And when I say that all people benefit from the exchange, I truly mean that. I deeply believe that. And I've seen it work time and time again. It matters far beyond neurodivergence. Neuroinclusion includes neurotypical and neurodivergent folks alike. And most people I talk to, they feel really isolated. Social media creates connections that lead to ghostings. We watch through screens and forget how to interact. We perform community without actually building community. And events are one of the last remaining spaces where we try to do the real thing. But integration doesn't happen by putting people in the same room. It happens when the room itself is designed so that every person can actually show up, not perform showing up or mask to show up or make themselves smaller to show up, but actually show up. So the work that I do is about tweaking those spaces and building scaffolding so that all guests can show up as their authentic selves. When I talk about building scaffolding for different experiences, I do mean something very specific. Scaffolding is not accommodation. Accommodation is reactive. It responds to a need that someone has already identified, named, and asked for, like a dietary restriction. Scaffolding is proactive. It creates the conditions for multiple kinds of experiences to coexist in the same space without requiring anyone to identify themselves as different in order to access it. Scaffolding is what makes it possible for the person who needs to move around to move around without drawing attention to themselves, for the person who needs clarity to get clarity without having to ask, for the person who might not know yet what they need to find their way anyway. And it starts at the very beginning with the invitation, the structure, and the boundaries, long before anyone gets their name tag at a check-in table. So this standard model, accommodations available upon request, asks a neurodivergent person to first recognize that what they're feeling is a need, then to name the need, then to assess whether it's safe to ask, then communicate it to a stranger in an environment that they may not fit in while managing everything else. And that's an enormous amount of invisible labor that's happening before they ever come and find you. Neurodivergent people have often gained a greater level of insight into the neurotypical society and its norms instead of vice versa. And this makes sense when we think about neurodivergent folks masking and camouflaging to fit in. They have to observe and mirror to be able to do so. The invisible labor often comes from this exact point. A neurotypical person really has no requirement or obligation to understand the neurodivergent experience unless they are closely related socially in some way. So, thank you to those of us who are here and learning together, because it means a lot to have you in this space. There is a framework that I want to share with you before we get into the practical tools, because it reframes what's actually happening in a guest's body before your program even begins. In 2003, writer Christine Miserandino, who lives with lupus, developed what she calls the spoon theory to explain chronic illness to someone who had never experienced it. And the concept is simple. Imagine that every task in your day costs a spoon. Most people wake up with a full supply and move through their day without ever noticing the exchanges. Neurodivergent people often start with fewer spoons, and environments that require things like constant sensory management, social calculation, or ambiguity cost them additional spoons that they hadn't planned to spend. So by the time your guests arrive at your event, they may have already spent spoons on the commute, deciding what to wear, or not knowing what to expect when they get there. And the not knowing alone is a cost, which is why so many of the tools that I'm going to share with you are really just about giving the spoons back and removing the unnecessary expenditures before the event even starts. So let's play that out in real time with my spoon. And I'll tell you a little secret about me. Although you now know my role, I've worked a lot of events, I plan events, I'm here. I really don't enjoy networking events. I like designing them, but I don't love attending them as a guest. Because when I, a neurodivergent, enter into a networking event as a guest, this is kind of what happens. I make small talk with the check-in table. I force a really relaxed smile and I get my name tag. But behind the check-in table, I'm already tracking the movement and deciding where in the room I'm going to land. I'm not actually listening to what the person at the check-in table is telling me as she puts this check next to my name on her spreadsheet. In fact, I'm just seeing that she checked it off and I can move on. That cost me a spoon. I pick a seat and I set down my things. This is my attempt to mark my territory and feel like I have a place. But I have this sneaking suspicion that the host of the event is going to make me move halfway through, probably in an attempt to maximize networking and really make this event worth the ticket price. It's another spoon. I sit down and the gentleman next to me is named Mark. Mark works in sales, and I know because I already read his name tag. Mark says hi, and dear God, Mark has a lot more energy than I do. So I take a big breath and bring my levels up to mirror his, and it feels taxing already. Another spoon. I tell Mark what I do, and my voice naturally softens as I relax into the most comfortable version of myself. But Mark notices the shift, and his eyes kind of start to look elsewhere. He's deciding how he wants to exit our conversation. And I get it. So I do us both a favor and I end it for him. I say, well, Mark, it was so nice to meet you. I'm going to go grab a glass of water. And momentarily, I have forgotten that I brought my water bottle and it is on the table in front of me. But it's okay because Mark seems okay to forget as well. Minus another spoon. The host walks up the steps to the stage and they say into the microphone that we'll get started in 5 minutes. Amazing. I plan to hide in the restroom for the next 4. Your neurodivergent guests are burning up their energy before your event ever begins. And most planners don't find this out until they're reaching out to somebody like me, wondering why their numbers are shrinking. Because when an event costs that much energy, your guests are not going to tell you why. They're going to leave and probably not come back. And this is usually when planners decide that they need to get an outside perspective. Things just aren't working. The audience has changed. Guest engagement isn't happening in the same ways anymore. They've changed the venue, the outline, the time frame, and yet it's still the same folks in the room. So there are 4 key ways that I believe we can give spoons back to our guests. And these are the 4 ways that I responded to my son during our conversation about the house. I made connection easy. I gave permission to experience something differently. I offered opportunities to opt in, not out, and I used language to build the experience. These 4 things are going to become the scaffolding for how we design neuro-inclusive events. And together, we're going to talk through some really practical tools that do the following. Remove barriers to entry by designing for the arrival, not just the start of the program. Explicitly name what guests are allowed to do, because I believe that permission is hospitality. Build proactive scaffolding so that no one has to identify themselves in order to access it. And use language in the first 5 minutes of your program that tells folks whether they belong. Being a neuro-inclusive event, building a neuro-inclusive event, being in the neuro-inclusive event. Design, oh my gosh, you guys, talking for an hour? Whoa. Building a neuro-inclusive event starts before the guests arrive. We made it. Okay, we can keep going. The most invisible assumptions in event design live in the time before the event itself, in what you send people and what you don't, what you tell them to expect, and what you leave them to figure out on their own. If you send a guest a schedule in advance, you've already done something super, super important. You've told them there is a plan, the plan is knowable, and they are trusted to be a person who can hold it. And for a lot of neurodivergent guests and many guests who deal with social anxieties or even just really busy schedules, the unknown isn't just uncomfortable, it is the stressor. The event itself may be perfectly manageable, but this not knowing is its own event, happening in their nervous system before they ever walk into the space. I will say the pre-event information guide is something that a lot of people are doing incredibly well. We saw an increase in these guides over the last few years, mostly being sent via email prior to the event itself. And most of these guides include the schedule, food options, parking information, and who to contact with questions. The pieces that I would strongly recommend adding are these. If the building or entrance is tough to find, share an actual photo of the entrance. Send a map with landmarks, a photo of the building, and exact locations and pricing for parking. Also consider and communicate what you want your guests to wear. What exactly does casual mean to you? Do you care what they wear? Will your guests feel out of place if they're like me and wearing a hoodie when the person next to them is wearing a dress? Clear communication allows your guests to make informed and autonomous decisions about how they choose to show up. If your event is being live recorded, tell your guests ahead of time. There's nothing worse for someone with social anxiety than to turn around and have a camera in their face when they're not expecting it. And lastly, please send out actual details before the event. Give your guests a few days to fully take in the information and to reach out if they have any questions. That time frame is incredibly important. Most planners treat pre-program time as dead time, like a buffer. But for neurodivergent guests, the pre-program period is live time. It's when sensory intake is the highest, social ambiguity is the greatest, and the most cognitive load is already being spent. You are already making choices about that time. Music is either playing or it isn't. Staff are greeting people or standing in clusters talking to each other. The room either has a clear flow or it doesn't. Those are all design choices, but they may not necessarily be being made intentionally. So here's one of the most impactful things that I've seen work: a quiet entrance time. Guests are invited to arrive 30 minutes before the official program begins. The room is quiet, there's no background music, no announcements over a speaker, just space, and the soft beginning of connection for people who need a gentler entry point. And after 15 of those 30 minutes, when the soft music begins to play, it will slowly build, subtly over time, into the more upbeat energy that we associate with the start of an event or a conference. And when we intentionally raise the energy level, we put those details into the timeline of our event so that our guests know what to expect and have the autonomy to enter the event at a pace that feels right for them. This is an example of a design choice being made to hold a range of arrival experiences. That is scaffolding. One of the simplest things that you can do is to give different areas of your space different purposes and name them super clearly. A networking zone, a seating area where people can get settled before re-engaging, a room for folks who need to take phone calls or respond to an email. This is not about creating a special area for a special need. It's about removing the assumption that everyone is ready to engage in the same ways at the same time throughout your event. And we do this already. There's a bar, a buffet, vendor tables, specific areas for specific activities. A named zone gives people a legitimate reason to meet their needs, especially in a room where nearly everyone will have a different need at a different time. So I would consider having 4 zones prepared and communicated within your event. A networking zone, or at least a specified networking time, because sometimes these zones may simply be blocks of time with guided interactions instead of a physical space. You still want to guide the interaction and name it and build that scaffolding around it, but it can look a little bit different depending on the theme and the purpose of the event itself. You may consider an area to settle in. Most of the time, this looks like soft seating along the backside of the venue, or perhaps a room before the room where the main event takes place, somewhere that guests can step out and re-enter as they can. And I would strongly consider having lower seating to the ground instead of just high top tables with bar stools. I have a person close to me in my life who has narcolepsy with cataplexy. And so when she has an experience that she needs to sit down, she needs to physically sit. And you want to consider that as well. I have multiple clients who have physical disabilities. Someone who is in a wheelchair and a scooter isn't going to be able to utilize the same seating, the settle in area that someone with a more able body might. You also might consider, depending on the event, that it could be important to have a working zone where folks can step away to take a call or respond to an email, depending on the environment. But the point is to be able to do so without disrupting the folks next to them. This quiet space is also something that you could consider as well, where someone who's experiencing sensory overload to go and regulate for a little bit. And it's really important to not only name these physical spaces or these time-constrained experiences, but to provide boundaries around them. A boundary around a quiet space may sound something like this when you introduce it. To better accommodate the different needs within a setting like this, we have set aside a sensory-friendly area for guests who may need to decompress, recenter, ground, regulate during the event. We are intentionally protecting this space, and we ask that you help us do the same. This is not a space to take calls or work. It's a space for those of us whose nervous systems may need a break to take a break. Here's something that neurotypical event design almost never does. Explicitly tell your guests what they're allowed to do. And I understand why it could feel unnecessary. We expect adults to be adults and to self-manage. But for a neurodivergent person who has spent years in a space where their natural behaviors were too much, too little, or didn't quite fit, explicit permission is part of hospitality. It provides the boundaries and the rules for engagement that make everyone feel more comfortable. The opening of your event is a design moment. What you say in the first 5 minutes tells everyone what kind of space it is and whether or not they belong in it. And you truly don't need to make this clinical, you just need to make it count. In the first 60 seconds of my time with you, I gave you permission to show up however you felt most comfortable. I told you what to expect with my eye contact and the density of certain slides. I told you that your camera didn't need to be on and that you can do whatever you need to do. Now, you and I both know your camera being off or on is entirely a preference thing. But think about the first time someone said that to you on a Zoom call. It was such a relief to let go of that stressor and to immediately know what the expectations were for how you engage in the space. And that relief is what we want to bring into your guests. So let your guests know how you want them to move throughout the space. Are there aisles or walkways that you'll have performers or speakers come up? Do you need those aisles to stay clear? Communicate that. Did you set up clear zones? Tell your guests about them and label them. Give them permission to go use what you've built and created. Has there been a change in today's schedule of events? Say that. Some people plan their days, childcare, or work calls around what they perceive to be gaps or breaks in your event. So tell them what to expect. Are your cameras going to be stationary or moving throughout the space? If stationary, where are they pointing? Where can guests walk versus not walk so they don't mess up anybody who's watching a live stream? Maybe even tape the ground so that guests know, walk behind this line and the camera won't see you. And lastly, give them permission to step out and to come back. It's so simple, but it really communicates that your guests are continually welcome in your space. And that's important to say out loud. Most events assume that guests know how to initiate connection and are comfortable doing so. That assumption excludes a lot of people, not just neurodivergent people, but introverts, newcomers, people who are just socially exhausted. Everyone needs a little bit more scaffolding before they show up as themselves. So, what if the name tag did some of that work for you? Some of the social work in that moment? Name, industry, and a line that says, I'd like to meet a graphic designer or someone with out of the box ideas or folks in my industry. Suddenly, the opening of a conversation doesn't require just small talk. It requires pointing at and reading or simply restating what's already on your name tag. And if you recall my story earlier about spoons and my new friend named Mark, you'll recall that I had already glanced at Mark's name tag before we started talking. And chances are that Mark had read mine as well. We made small talk awkwardly, and then we fairly abruptly ended the conversation. But a line like this would have provided another bid for connection past the generic topics that Mark and I had already discussed, names and what we do. This little addition adds an opportunity for guests to do less labor than what they're already used to doing in a space where your energy, the networking energy, the energy that you're trying to build at the start of your event as people meet is key. You're just making that a little bit easier. Now, I'm sure you already know that having several dietary options available is absolutely key to a successful meal or break time during an event. But do you know that for some neurodivergent folks, food can also be a regulation tool? Research consistently shows that chewing activates powerful receptors in the jaw, providing deep pressure feedback that can influence nervous system regulation. Which is why a piece of gum, a mint, or something crunchy isn't actually just a preference, it's a tool. The act of chewing or eating something can help bring a guest back to a more regulated state where they can re engage after feeling over or understimulated. Getting up outside of a designated food time is uncomfortable. Opening the crinkly wrapper of a granola bar during the silence of a speaker is uncomfortable. It draws attention, and a guest, neurotypical or neurodivergent, has to calculate whether or not they're willing to receive that attention to accommodate their need. Now, some neurodivergent folks also experience what's known as interoceptive differences, which is a reduced ability to accurately sense or interpret the body's internal signals. Researchers have known for quite some time that neurodivergence can disrupt the ability to sense body signals such as pain, hunger, or thirst. And many neurodivergent individuals experience these interoceptive signals as either muted or amplified. And some may not notice their internal cues until they become extreme, like feeling dizzy from hunger. And by then, they no longer have the capacity to decide whether or not drawing attention to themselves is worth it. and they're no longer paying attention to what you're trying to say from the stage. I do want to point out that I'm truly not suggesting that you extend your lunch hour to 3 hours. That would be wild. My suggestion is that we help mitigate some of these discrepancies intentionally. Gum or mints on the table, snacks at various areas throughout the space, maybe next to the coffee, something by the registration table, maybe something between the vendor tables, because these serve as a regulation tool. They can help guests focus. And, they ease the anxieties around breathing garlic breath in someone else's face after lunch. So, really, it benefits absolutely everyone. In events, there's an arc to these events that most planners are familiar with. We introduce guests to the experience, we build the tension, bring in our key speaker, hit the emotional peak during the story, and ride this wave of collective effervescence into a time of either giving or gratitude. But the research suggests that neurodivergent guests don't experience collective effervescence in the same way that neurotypical guests do. In fact, they may not experience it at all. There's a sociologist who coined the term collective effervescence, which is the emotional energy generated when a group moves together toward a shared purpose. But in a neurodivergent body, this moment doesn't really happen. A neurodivergent person may be sitting inside of this experience, surrounded by people who seem to be seeing, feeling, and participating in something that isn't inherently felt in the neurodivergent nervous system. The energy in the room rises quickly, and the neurodivergent person becomes aware of the dissonance between them and the person next to them. And so they mask. They mirror the folks around them in hopes of it making sense to their body. But with all that effort, it still may not land the same. So there's a few things I suggest to combat the potential whiplash of this moment, to help build the scaffolding for all of the guests in the room. And it really comes down to language. Tell your guests what they can expect. For example, you are going to hear our next speaker share their firsthand experience. If you feel compelled to clap, cheer, or stand on your feet, please feel free to do so. We want your support in making this speaker feel at home on our stage. Or maybe you acknowledge that guests may feel emotionally impacted by the story, and there are tissues on the tables in case guests need them. And then bring your guests down from the moment. Say something to land it, like, wow, I didn't see a dry eye in the house. Thank you, speaker, for sharing from your heart. I invite you all to take a collective breath with us as we watch the video or whatever the next step is. Our goals are scaffolding through language and collective co-regulation in a shared space. These two things invite your neurodivergent guests into the experience while guiding them through it. And everything I've described so far happens in the design phase, but there's a human layer too. The staff and volunteers present on the day are either part of the scaffolding or a gap in the scaffolding. When a neurodivergent person approaches a volunteer with a question, something has already happened before they open their mouth. They've run that checklist that we talked about earlier. Is this a request that anyone could reasonably make? Will it draw attention? Is it safe to ask? And most of the time, they'd rather find their own solution than risk the interaction. The fact that they're standing in front of you at all means something. So here's my favorite example of what a well-trained volunteer looks like in practice. If I ask about the timeline, I love the idea of a volunteer ending their response with, if there are any changes I hear about before you do, I will do my best to come and find you. Where are you sitting? That response does three things at once. Answers the question, anticipates the anxiety underneath it, and transfers some of the monitoring burden from the guest back to the team. So let's take this same concept, the neuro-informed staff or volunteer interaction, and apply it to a different piece of the event, the registration table. And I'll be honest with you, there isn't much you can do to train a staff member to do differently when the room is noisy, when there's visual stimuli everywhere, and when some guests are treating the line as networking time instead of completing the tasks at hand. However, you can adjust your floor plan to better accommodate for your registration area. You can move the table closer to the front door and create more of a visual transition to the remainder of the room. You can tuck the registration along the left or the right wall so guests aren't immediately looking at the crowd when they walk in. Sometimes a minor floor plan change is exactly what you need to cut through this stimuli that makes it tough for guests to engage. One of the people who has most shaped the conversation about neuro-inclusive event design isn't a researcher or a clinician. She's an event professional like you and me. Megan Henshaw is a senior executive at Google and the founder of the New Project, an initiative born out of her experience watching her son, Otis, navigate a world that wasn't designed for his nervous system. What started as a mother trying to understand her child's experience became one of the most influential frameworks for neuroinclusion in the events industry. Henshaw has said that neurodivergent people have been masking at events for many, many years, and they've asked very little of us as designers to proactively see them. And I think about that a lot because the ask overall really isn't that big, but the return, a guest who can show up, engage, and give, is absolutely everything. So, what I want you to do tomorrow morning, not eventually, just tomorrow morning, is not to overhaul your next event. It's much simpler than that. I want you to think beyond the assumed experience, and I want you to get curious, to stop being afraid to ask for feedback, to try different things, to be vulnerable in how you show up, to take risks in the best possible ways. Megan also said, we don't need it to be right. We just need to learn. And that's all that I'm asking. And then see how it goes. And finally, I want to say something directly to anyone who's listening who isn't a planner or who is a planner and also knows what it's like to be on the other side of this. When I finally came to terms with the fact that I had different needs than the way traditional events were designed, I stopped leaving events early due to the discomfort of being there in the first place. And I started to feel like I belonged. I want you to hear that there are people who care deeply about building spaces where your nervous system isn't quite so on edge, where you don't have to white knuckle it through the first hour, where you don't have to reverse engineer a role just to feel like you belong. So I see you, I get it, and I'm making a difference. So before we open up space for questions, I wanted to come to you prepared with a few of the questions I hear most often in the work that I do. The first is, how do I make a case for this to my board or leadership? And I would say, approach it first from the framing of inclusion and then the return on your investment. If 20% of your audience is neurodivergent, then by making minor adjustments to the framing of your event, you are effectively reaching the 20% that's currently isolated. It's really about the overall performance of your event, not just the accommodation aspect. And as you start building more inclusive spaces with intentionality, more guests will feel comfortable, word of mouth will travel, and more guests will show up. The next question is, what if my venue won't let me change the space? Great. Most of the tools I suggested actually require very little changing of things. They are simple tweaks you can do that don't require venue approval and don't significantly add to your budget, if at all. Where could you start if you could only do one thing? Give your guests permission. Permission to be, permission to engage, permission to move and take breaks and come back and feel impacted by the stories that you share. And lastly, how do I gather feedback without putting neurodivergent people on the spot? Thank you for thinking about that. If you are not already sending post-event surveys now, like right now, is when you need to start doing that. Start with what would have made this event easier and see what feedback starts to show up. So, Samantha, can you check out the chat for me and tell me what other questions have shown up, if any?
Absolutely. I want to encourage folks to drop their questions in the chat for Paige so that we can make sure that we answer things that are coming up for you. Or in the Q&A, if you want to add to the Q&A bar. I do have two questions that have come up though. The first one is if we're talking about 20% of our attendees, how often are attendees just choosing not to come? And how do we include language in the pre-event comms that perhaps would, or in our marketing, that would perhaps get folks to understand that we're making design choices?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I think that comes back to the permission part of it and the communication. There was a portion of this where I said how to tee up your quiet area and saying like, we value this. We've put in protections for this. We are guarding this space intentionally. We are building this in. Using language like that to prep your guests for what they're going to experience is really key. I think it also on that, if you have guests that aren't showing up, I just want to say I often back out of events as a guest because when all of these spoons are gone, even if I want to show up, I can't show up. So I think the other part of this is giving your guests permission to say, like, your RSVP matters to us. And then let them know what happens if they do miss it. Like with this webinar, you're going to get the recording, it's going to be available. Saying those things out loud allow them to evaluate their own capacity and show up with autonomy and as they're going to.
I love it. You also have a lot of gratitude showing up in the chat.
Mm.
A lot of attendees that are appreciative that we're having the conversation, that it's been a great presentation, and just appreciative as someone who is neurodivergent, understanding that there is folks doing this work. So thank you for that, Paige. Um,
Yeah.
Cecily is asking, what sort of things do you give permission for? Can you dive a little bit deeper into that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it might be helpful for me to say a couple of the ways that I feel like I don't have permission at events. One of them is like the camera thing. If there are cameras moving throughout a space, especially cameras pointing at a stage, I will not move in the first half of the room, even if they're only pointing at the stage, because I don't know, is that camera going to pan to the left or the right? Am I going to be in the way? Am I going to take away from someone else's experience? I think a really neurodivergent response is to often make ourselves feel small, and to kind of minimize our own accidental disruptions, right? So something like I said, taping the floor for cameras, or you're free to, if you need to take a phone call, we actually have a space for you to do that. We have an entire room where you can go. We're not projecting sound in there, but you're welcome to come right back into the event when you're ready. Things like that feel maybe innate or like a natural thing that a neurotypical person wouldn't even consider. Um, and if we tie in the concept of neurodivergent folks not understanding their physical needs sometimes, not recognizing hunger, thirst, or needing to use the restroom, even language like, please take care of whatever you need to. If you need to use the restroom, grab a snack, refill your coffee. We've made space for that. Those little details give so much permission to just be in ways that people might not consider it.
I love that. We have an anonymous attendee that has said, can you talk a little bit more about balancing messaging for the different aspects? As someone who is neurodivergent, I often feel completely overwhelmed by visuals or signs, but would totally utilize different spaces at the event. I'm always afraid of overloading emails with info as well.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm a big QR code fan, which I know feels like a little crazy. But if people are, I actually suggested this to someone. So part of the work that I do is also being the behind the scenes person for event professionals. So when somebody has a brief or something that they need to nail, that they need a professional's input on, I show up as an anonymous participant and help them before they go to wherever it is that they're going, provide feedback on their designs, and somebody came to me with a question that was very similar to this. She worked for a marketing company and they had so many stories that her board wanted her to tell. Stories that were past clients, big wins that people had. And she said the same thing. How am I supposed to put in all of this information? Because no one's going to read it. So, what we did was place small QR codes with a singular quote about what the work was. So, whether it was a quote that the client themselves had said, or a statistic from the work that they've done with a QR code below it. And when you scan the QR code, it shared the story. I would invite you to do something very similar to your events. Maybe say, like, if you have a seating area and you have a QR code that says, this is a quiet zone, scan to learn more. Then your guest scans it and they see this, these are the rules for engagement in this space. But somebody who reads that and says, oh, it's quiet, I can't talk, we came over to talk, they're not going to sit down. And so that immediately, the quote and the code gives them a little bit of insight and an opportunity to opt in and learn more.
I have a lot of sort of positive comments and love showing up for you, Paige. And I wanted to let
Oh,
you know that Cassie says that our organization works with adults with IDD I'm always trying to be more aware when I plan our events of what people might need. And it's nice knowing that some of what I'm doing is right. And I've definitely learned a few things also.
Oh,
So
thank you.
thank you for that. I have a
Yeah.
question for you.
Yeah,
How do you balance quiet entry with still feeling event ready? Because I
totally.
frequently walk into an event that the lights are not, there's no vibe, basically.
Hmm.
And it
Yeah.
feels like, oh, they're not ready. And it immediately makes me feel I should not be here, one.
Yeah.
And two, they're disorganized.
Yeah.
So, how
Totally.
do you balance quiet entry? Because I usually use things like setting a vibe with lighting and music so that it's half an hour ready, every volunteer's in place, all,
Hmm.
everything's open, and the music and the lighting is saying, we're here and we're ready for you.
Yeah.
What's that like balance there?
Yeah, awesome question. And I love that you're pointing out where we as planners are intentionally building a space versus this room for expanding the space. So I'll just use your conference because I've
Oh,
attended it. We talked about it. I think it's a great, easy visual. You have a huge screen on the front. I would put something on the screen that says, we're 30 minutes out, enjoy the quiet with us, grab your coffee, like give them a couple of examples, and then 15 minutes out you change it to, we're starting to get excited, something that like communicates this visual piece. But also you have that aspect of visual that's physically there on the day. And I would seriously build this concept into your messaging as well, where you tell people like, we're intentionally putting focus on the entrance of the event. We want you to feel comfortable and welcome. Here's how we're doing that. Please feel free to show up anytime between 30 minutes or our start time. We'll welcome you regardless.
I love that. Well, I
Yeah,
don't see any more questions yet. If anyone has any other
perfect.
questions, please do drop them. Paige, how do people find you if they want to continue this conversation?
Absolutely. Well, here. So this is a lot of the work that I do. If you have any more questions, please feel free to email me. I'm on LinkedIn as Paige Jacobs. I'm on socials as Powered by Paige. I do my best to respond to everything in a timely manner, but I do read everything that I get sent. The consulting work that I do is really pretty simple. It's a lot of this. I find the thread, the through point in your event, I untangle it, and I hand it right back to you. The what of this is exactly what we just did together. So if you need help with the how, I would genuinely love to help. So please find me. And with that, that's what I've got for you. I want to hear your questions. I want to chat more. So find me and let's be friends.
Paige, thank you for this work. Thank you for bringing such thoughtful intentionality to it. As you mentioned, you've been to the Elevate conference, an event we produce, and I have been so appreciative of your feedback and helping us to be even more intentional and thoughtful in everything we do. You are so good at what you do. So I hope folks reach out. I do want to remind everyone that Paige is moving. So good luck on your move. I wish you lots of love. I know that that's a lot of hard work, but give a little grace if it's a minute before you hear back if you reach out, only because the 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 life is busy right now. So Paige, thank you for being here. Everyone that joined us, thank you. And we will get this recording out to you soon so you can come back to it and share it with others. And we hope you continue to think about how to build more inclusive spaces. Thanks, everyone.